If you drew a line between Seattle's streetcars, it would pass right through some of the city's biggest employment and tourism centers, creating high-capacity street-level transit that a lot of people would probably use. But nobody's drawn that line yet. Instead, the city's streetcar network exists as two separate lines with no direct connection and very different goals. So who rides these? Could they ever become one system? And why is one line getting 7 times more ridership than the other? The only way to find out is to go for a ride. Let's take a look at the map. Downtown Seattle is located in western Washington state on an isthmus of land between the Puget Sound and Lake Washington. The 1.3-mile South Lake Union streetcar, which opened in December 2007, runs from the Westlake Center Mall through downtown Denny Triangle and South Lake Union, before ending at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. This area is filled with shopping and dining options, along with numerous tech offices, most notably the headquarters of Amazon. The 2.5-mile First Hill streetcar, meanwhile, joined the system in January 2016. Starting in Pioneer Square, it passes through several neighborhoods, including Chinatown International District, Yesler Terrace, First Hill, and Capitol Hill, serving several hospitals, Seattle University, Seattle Central College, and the city's Amtrak station. While no connecting track exists between the two streetcar lines, riders can transfer from one to the other using the one line of Seattle's Link Light Rail. I started my journey on the Seattle streetcars at 5th and Jackson Station on the First Hill line. This shelter sits in the middle of South Jackson Street, just steps away from International District Station on the light rail and Amtrak's King Street Station. Standing here amid the hustle and bustle, one can imagine the historic streetcars that used to run here until their removal in 2005? Am I reading that right? As it turns out, yes. After the removal of first-generation streetcars in the early 1940s, Seattle had a heritage streetcar that ran from here to the city's waterfront between 1982 and 2005. It wasn't long before a car arrived, one of the 6 Inicon 121 trios that ply the line. You might notice that the car isn't connected to an overhead power source. This is a unique feature of the First Hill line. Cars receive overhead power going northbound, but run on battery power for portions of their southbound journeys, as their right-of-way is shared with trolley buses, which use a completely different type of overhead wire. Each First Hill car was originally painted a different color to represent a location along the route. This yellow car represents one of the traditional colors of Chinatown. This white car is painted in a newer livery honoring the 3 Asian diaspora neighborhoods that make up the Chinatown International District neighborhood, through which the line passes. Japantown lies to the north of the tracks, while Chinatown can be found to the south. After we passed under Interstate 5, we arrived in Little Saigon, which features street signs in Vietnamese. From here, we turned left onto 14th Street, then again onto Yesler Way, passing a streetcar wrapped for Turkish Airlines. If you'd like to see my trip report on that airline, click up in the top right. We headed west through Yesler Terrace for a few blocks, rapidly gaining elevation. Then we turned onto Broadway, which we would follow for the remainder of the hilly journey. So why did this part of Seattle get a modern streetcar? Well, during the development of Seattle's light rail, an underground link station was considered for the First Hill neighborhood, but weak soil and expensive tunneling costs proved prohibitive. Instead, city officials and transit planners began exploring alternate rapid transit for the region, ultimately settling on a streetcar with light rail stations on both ends. This was approved as part of the Sound Transit 2 ballot measure in November 2008 and opened 8 years later. You'll notice looking down Broadway that there are dedicated bike lanes along the streetcar tracks. These were installed after a series of bike accidents took place along the South Lake Union line. Unfortunately, they haven't perfectly prevented subsequent accidents along this line. Jumping off at the northern end, I took a look at the shelter, and boy was it a mess. The thing was covered in dirt and grime, with an old and broken screen. This would sadly hold true for many of the streetcar shelters I would encounter during the day. Could someone explain to me why King County Metro can't just send out a guy in a truck with a power washer once a month to take care of things? Seattle streetcars also had a low-floor segment in the middle, with wheelchair ramps that deploy when needed. I watched the car pull off down Broadway, headed back to Chinatown, then headed into the light rail station next door, where I caught the one line to Westlake. The South Lake Union line begins in McGraw Square, where I almost caught a streetcar going north. This is one of the 3 Onicon 12 cars on the line, similar to those on the First Hill system but lacking the latter's onboard batteries. You can spot all kinds of transit from here, including double-decker commuter buses, trolley buses, and the famous Seattle Center monorail. On both this system and the First Hill line, riders are expected to tap their Orca cards on external validators prior to boarding. I made sure to do this, but nobody ever checked if I did, so I'm going to guess a lot of people ride without paying. Soon our car arrived. This is the sole Inicon 121 on the line, and it arrived in Seattle later than the others. Amazon didn't just buy the ad space on this car, they straight up paid for the car itself, to increase service frequency in the neighborhood around their headquarters. Indeed, this whole corridor has been heavily influenced by the tech sector, with Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen and his venture capital firm Vulcan Incorporated not only lobbying for the streetcar, but also financially contributing to its construction. Long ago, these neighborhoods north of downtown contained low-rise industrial sprawl, but today they're anything but that, featuring various tech offices along with shopping and dining options. Streetcars run here in transit priority lanes, which were installed in 2016 to compensate for slow travel times along the line. Along certain segments, they're shared with King County Metro's Rapid Ride buses. After passing the streetcar barn and making a quick jaunt down Terry Avenue, we emerged onto the waterfront of Lake Union, which we followed until the final stop at the Fred Hutchinson Research Center. As you might be able to already tell, Seattle streetcars are incredibly different. The First Hill Line was built as a high-capacity street-level transit between multiple commercial, residential, and transit hubs, and it scored 4,000 riders a day in 2023. The South Lake Union Line, on the other hand, was built to connect downtown to a new local development, and it only managed to net 500 daily riders last year, 1/8 of the First Hill Line's ridership. Indeed, low ridership has been a recurring pattern with the older streetcar since its opening, and it's garnered its fair share of critics. And to be honest, while I fondly remember riding it as a 9-year-old, it didn't impress me that much at 25. The buses that run this whole route can do the same thing for cheaper, and they cover longer distances. But what if there was a way to link these two disparate streetcars into one really good service? Well, that's where the culture connector comes in. This hypothetical 1.27-mile track would run through downtown Seattle between the two streetcars, serving places like Pike Place Market, the Seattle Museum of Art, and Pioneer Square. Estimated daily ridership would be 11,000 passengers, more than double what the lines currently carry. This route has been seriously considered for a number of years, but it would also be expensive. Between 2019 and 2024, the estimated price tag of the project rose by 40%, and City Hall now believes it would cost over $400 million to construct. Costs could be slashed by pedestrianizing some of downtown, but that would likely face some pushback. Some of the right-of-way would also have to go down streets built on century-old infrastructure that raises them above the swampy ground. Said infrastructure might need to be modified or rebuilt for trains. Right now, the city of Seattle is facing a looming budget deficit. Streetcars aren't at the forefront of the agenda, and enthusiasm isn't really there, due in part to lackluster ridership on the existing lines, especially the South Lake Union one. So it's really up in the air whether the connector will ever be built. And if it doesn't, the issue of even keeping the streetcars running remains. While they're operated by King County Metro, the city's bus operator, they don't receive operational funding from the agency. Instead, this funding has come from the city, including in the form of commercial parking tax revenue. But by 2028, the streetcars will need an estimated $12.9 million a year just to stay operational. Just from looking at ridership, the First Hill Line would likely be the city's priority to maintain. The South Lake Union Line, meanwhile, may have its days numbered, with a partial or complete shutdown coming in a few years due to light rail construction. And I'm not entirely positive it'll come back after that. To be honest, as much as us transit geeks like to romanticize the bygone streetcar era, these days there's only a few places where they still make sense. Downtown Seattle would be one of them, if the First Hill Line's success is any indicator, but building something here would take money and willpower, and I wouldn't hold my breath for either.